by the global news agencies like Associated Press and a few private broadcasters like CNN conform to the assumption of transnational capitalism, focusing on spectacles and political crises with a consumerist and market-related consequences. The paper that I shared with Dr. Bushra, and I would be happy to share with anyone that would want, you can simply email me, addresses the Associated Press coverage of the Crimean War, the Ukrainian conflict and the Crimean secession, the Syrian conflict, and the ongoing conflict in Venezuela. I could have picked more. I would encourage each of our students or any colleagues that would like to look at U.S. attacks on Venezuela, the U.S. and U.K. bombing of Libya, the ongoing Saudi war in Yemen, and I suspect you would find the same thing that I found in these few examples. The subject articles in the assessment were based upon the two primary Associated Press stories from each crisis. For instance, the Crimean case, there were two primary stories, and they became what the AP calls big stories. Likewise, when I looked at Venezuela or Syria, I used what AP said were their primary stories. There were several things that were found in each of these, and I suggest we would find these if we look at AP coverage of Libya, AP coverage of Mali, AP coverage of Venezuela. Those are, first, the discourse frames the conflict as a threat to civilization or some other legitimate force, and the justified responses. Threats to democracy and human rights justify a military response motivated by humanitarian concerns and democratic impulses. I wrote that in regards to the Ukrainian conflict. It applied to the Syrian conflict, and I would say that very phrase applies to Venezuela today. The U.S. media and the Associated Press presents threats to democracy and human rights, justifying a military response by the U.S. and the U.K. motivated by humanitarian concerns and democratic impulses. In each case, the Associated Press privileges, aligns with the most dominant neoliberal policies and also the neoliberal spokespeople in each government. There's several examples. The first is they subscribe to the privatization of national resources. They seek out the increased cooperation and alliance with transnational investors. They have a tolerance and preference for authoritarian measures, including austerity and, if necessary, security forces against the population. And there's an explicit privileging of increased or continued intervention by transnational players. Again, if we fast forward to today in Venezuela, the privatization of national resources is promoted by the so-called interim President Guaido. That's his official policy. The U.S. spokespeople have said security forces being moved against many of the democratic changes in Venezuela, and each trumpet the need for direct U.S. intervention. When I looked at Crimea, when I looked at Syria, and I looked at Venezuela, it was interesting that the Associated Press news sources condemning the Crimean referendum outnumbered the voices in support of the Crimean referendum, almost outnumbered 2-1. In the case of Venezuela, those recognizing the democratic election of Maduro versus those that supported the opposition boycott, it was a 4-1 imbalance. In other words, the Associated Press chose sources that aligned 2-1, 3-1, 4-1, and recently 8-1 in the current conditions, aligned with the intervention by the United States, the UK, and Canada. Opponents, I would say only one conclusion can be drawn about AP's preferred news sources based on these 3 examples and the others that I have cited. The Associated Press privileges news sources that echo the policy preferences of the globally dominant governments and their institutions. NATO and the EU want expansion into the Ukraine, then democratic decisions by even a portion of the population interferes with transnational plans. Then AP features voices in support of the Ukrainian integration with the EU.